Hitler did not lose the war in a single moment, but there was a day when the illusion finally cracked, when even he, buried in layers of denial, rage, and ego, had to face the truth he had spent years avoiding. That moment came in the first weeks of 1945, inside the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, when the Battle of the Ardennes collapsed and the Soviets tore open the Eastern Front with a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. For years, Hitler had repeated the same belief, that Germany's enemies would break before he did. But by that winter, it was Germany itself that was breaking. And for a man whose entire worldview depended on the fantasy of destiny and victory, admitting defeat was equal to admitting that his entire ideology had been a lie. He began 1945, convinced he could still shape events through sheer willpower. His delusion had grown to the point where he believed his intuition was more powerful than his general's expertise, more accurate than reconnaissance reports, and more reliable than the laws of logistics. Yet even the most delusional leader eventually collides with reality. That collision happened when the Ardennes offensive, the gamble he had placed all remaining Western resources on, collapsed faster than any of his staff feared. He had promised that this surprise attack would split the Allies, drive them back to the sea, and force a negotiated peace. Instead, within days, it became clear that the offensive had burned through the Reich's last reserves of fuel, manpower, and armored strength. Hitler read the reports in silence at first. The numbers were catastrophic, tank losses that could not be replaced, divisions that had evaporated, entire units retreating not because of enemy pressure, but because they were out of supplies. The dream of pushing the Allies back had ended before it had truly begun. In the West, Germany had shot its final bolt, and everyone in that bunker knew it. For the first time in weeks, Hitler's hands trembled visibly as he held the papers. He refused to acknowledge it verbally, but the atmosphere became funereal. The war in the West was effectively lost, but it was the East that delivered the final blow to his illusions. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula Oder Offensive, one of the most overwhelming military operations in human history. More than 2 million Soviet troops smashed into the German lines with a momentum that stunned even experienced Wehrmacht officers. Entire German armies disintegrated in days. The Soviets advanced 300 miles in a matter of weeks, rolling across Poland, crossing into Germany itself, and closing in on Berlin. When Hitler received the first emergency call from the Eastern Front, he erupted with denial and fury. He insisted the reports were exaggerated. He blamed the generals. He blamed sabotage. He blamed cowardice. But as more fragmented messages arrived, a new kind of silence fell over the bunker. It was the silence of inevitability. Guderian, his army chief of staff, confronted him with the truth. There were no reserves left, no hidden divisions, no miracle weapons coming in time. The Eastern Front had collapsed beyond repair. Hitler stared at the map. The red arrows pushed deep into the heart of Germany, closer to Berlin than any enemy had been in centuries. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. His staff later said it was one of the rare moments when he seemed not furious, not ranting, but simply empty. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by another barrage of rage and denial, but the break had happened. He knew the truth, and once known, it could not be unknown. His delusion, however, did not fade. It shifted. Instead of believing he could win the war, he convinced himself that Germany did not deserve to survive if it could not achieve victory. If the German people were too weak to hold on, he said, they should be swept away by the coming storm. This was the moment when he mentally abandoned Germany, even as he continued to demand impossible counterattacks and non-existent reinforcements. The fantasy of a last-second reversal still flickered in his mind, but deep down he knew none would come. This moment of realization changed his behavior drastically. He stopped appearing in public entirely. He refused to travel to the front. even though he had spent earlier years insisting on personal oversight of operations. He withdrew into the bunker, surrounding himself with sycophants, maps, and the comforting illusion that the lines on the board could still be moved. But the lines were not symbols. They were the collapsing pieces of a dying war machine, and each day they shrank closer and closer to Berlin. Witnesses describe how he aged visibly in those weeks. His hands shook uncontrollably, his posture slumped, his voice lost its old commanding force. He walked with short, dragging steps, and his rage, once explosive and theatrical, turned inward, becoming a kind of sour despair. He spoke not of victory, but of fate, betrayal, and divine punishment. The man who had once promised a 1,000-year Reich could now barely imagine surviving the month. The truth became undeniable when he received the situation reports from January 25th onward. These reports showed that the Soviets were approaching the Oder River, just 45 miles from Berlin. At that point, the war was no longer about strategy or operations. It was about time. Germany was being invaded on both sides, and its armies were fighting blind, exhausted, starving, and hopeless. Hitler knew that once the Soviets reached the Oder, Berlin was practically within artillery range, and yet he still refused to order a retreat, insisting that every position be held to the last man. But this was not strategy, it was a mask. The act of ordering the impossible allowed him to pretend, even to himself, that the war still had a path back to victory. His generals could see through it. When they tried to explain the reality to him, he accused them of treachery or defeatism. Some were dismissed, others were screamed at until they stopped talking at all. The last voices of reality were being shut out of the room. The inner circle later said that the real turning point came late in January, when Hitler received fresh reconnaissance showing that Soviet spearheads had crossed to the Oder in multiple places. The breach was final. Nothing stood between the Red Army and Berlin except scattered, battered units with no fuel, no ammunition, and no reserves. Hitler stared at the maps for a long time. When he finally spoke, he didn't mention counterattacks or miracle weapons. He simply said, "It is over unless the West turns against the East." This was the first time he openly admitted defeat, even if only in a hypothetical way. The belief that the Allies might split became his final psychological shield. If the Western powers turned on the Soviets, he imagined that Germany could become useful again, perhaps even survive in some form. But this was not strategy. It was a desperate man searching for a way to avoid acknowledging complete collapse. By February, Berlin had become a graveyard of hopes. Air raid sirens never stopped. The city burned nightly. Civilians dug shelters deeper and deeper into the ground, and Hitler remained in the bunker, drifting further into paranoia and fatalism. He insisted that armies which no longer existed could be reformed. He demanded that divisions wiped off the map be restored. He gave orders to commanders who were already dead or captured. His delusion was no longer about victory. It was about refusing to face the responsibility for what he had unleashed. The psychological break was obvious to anyone around him. Albert Speer noticed that Hitler could no longer concentrate for more than a few minutes at a time. He repeated himself. He forgot conversations he'd had hours before. He drifted from one topic to another without logic. This was a man collapsing under the weight of his own fantasy world, a world that had finally shattered when the Eastern Front collapsed. Yet even as he realized the war was lost, he insisted that the German people continue fighting. He expected them to make sacrifices he himself would never make. When told that millions of civilians were suffering without food, water, or shelter, he responded coldly, saying that if they could not endure, they were worthless. The man who had spent years portraying himself as Germany's savior now viewed the nation as expendable, a disposable tool for his ego. When the Western Allies crossed the Rhine in March, another internal door shut. There would be no miracle split between the Allies. There would be no diplomatic rescue. Germany was being crushed from both directions. When Hitler saw the photographs of American troops walking across the wreckage of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, he didn't shout or rant. Instead, he slumped in his chair and stared into space. His generals knew that look. They had seen it once before after Stalingrad. It was the look of a man who knew the game was over. By April, the Soviet artillery could already be heard from Berlin. The city shook daily under bombardment. The bunker filled with dust, smoke, and the dull thunder of explosions. Hitler retreated further into himself. He slept most afternoons. He refused medical checks. He refused to believe reports that were anything less than catastrophic. In those final days, he spoke openly about the end. He compared himself to historical figures who had taken their own lives. He asked for news of old operas, old paintings, old memories, anything that reminded him of a world before the collapse he had orchestrated. The final realization came on April the 22nd, 1945, during one of the last military conferences, when he learned that the army group he believed would save Berlin was a fiction, that the divisions he expected to counterattack simply did not exist. He exploded in a meltdown so severe that even his closest followers were shaken. He shouted that the war was lost, that everything was ruined, that the generals had betrayed him, that Germany was finished. In that moment, the last illusions died. There was no future for the Reich, and there was no future for him. From that point on, he prepared only for the end. He refused to leave Berlin. He refused to surrender. He refused to see the outside world. He spent the last days in a dim bunker, pacing a few steps at a time, writing his final political will and blaming everyone but himself. He had known for months that the war was lost, but on April the 22nd, he finally admitted it aloud. This was the day Hitler realized the war was lost, not because a single event forced him to, but because every layer of denial had finally been stripped away. The Germany he imagined no longer existed. The armies he commanded were broken. The empire he promised had collapsed into rubble, and the 1,000-year Reich he proclaimed had not lasted even 12. The war ended not with a glorious last battle, but with a leader whose delusion had finally failed him, sitting in a bunker beneath the ruins of the city he swore would be eternal. And when the truth could no longer be denied, he chose not to face it. He chose to escape it, leaving behind a world torn apart by the consequences of his own lies.